Hi, everyone. Okay, so we are switching gears now, away from Foucault and picking up Black Skin, White Masks by Frantz Fanon. Uh, so Fanon is an interesting character, certainly, a very interesting thinker, and ties into a number of the themes that we've been talking about this semester. Uh, Fanon was not just a philosopher, but also a doctor and psychiatrist and psychoanalyst. Is interested in, um, well, not just interested in, but practiced psychiatry and psychology, and was interested in sort of psychology as not just a medical practice, but also as a philosophical topic and method. Uh, so we're continuing to think about psychology, psychoanalysis, but he's also a thinker primarily of colonialism and racism. And we'll be thinking with Fanon then also about some of the other topics that we were discussing, particularly with Foucault and Freud also, but thinking about forms of social control and the way that ideology can be oppressive. So Fanon was born in Martinique when Martinique was a French colony. Martinique is in the Caribbean and right, was part of the French colonies in the Caribbean. He got his medical training there and was part of a very vibrant sort of Black intellectual culture that was part of Martinique at the time, along with the poet, playwright, and writer Aimé Césaire. He was part of this movement that began in Martinique called Negritude. It was really Césaire's movement. Fanon is really his own thing, but he comes out of this very rich, sort of cultural moment in Martinique, and you'll see him quoting Aimé Césaire, another post-colonial writer and thinker, and he is thinking about the effects of colonialism, the way that colonialism affects both the sort of individual psychology of the colonized person and the colonizer, and the larger global economic forces that are behind colonialism and all of the sort of intersections between the individual effects of colonialism and the global economic forces that drove colonialism. So these are sort of the essential terms for Fanon: colonizer and colonized. And his analysis of race, as well as his analysis of sort of politics and economics, can be viewed through the dichotomy that's established through colonialism between colonizer and colonized. For Fanon, colonialism is the driving force behind racism. And racism is, in many senses, an effect of colonization. So, just a little background on, the colonial world. Right? We're all familiar with the colonial world. The United States was a colony of England, and we are all probably familiar with just the fact of, you know, the colonization of Africa, the colonization of South America, Mexico, and so much of the rest of the world. Uh, so colonization begins historically with trade, right? And the first sort of forays into colonization were the trade with India, in particular, the Dutch East India Company. And, you know, India, which would go on to be a colony of England, was first sort of colonized, although not politically, by the East India Company. And that model is essentially the model for all colonialism, that there were economic interests that drove people to these faraway countries, and let me be more specific, right? That drove Europeans to countries around the world. So the first sort of stage of colonization is the development of trade ports, right? One of the most important trade ports, for example, was Hong Kong. Right? Hong Kong was a British colony until the 1990s. And we're seeing now in the struggle about, Hong Kong law and the Chinese government exerting control over Hong Kong, a sort of post-colonial struggle there. But anyway, right, most colonies began as trade ports, and they developed into full-blown colonial governments that would have political control over the people where those trade ports were. So not only is there a trade port that is established and populated and run by foreigners in these colonized countries, but at a certain point, those foreigners establish a government for the whole country, right? So colonization is just, there are two kinds of colonies. There are colonies that colonize a people, and colonies that are established within the bounds of someone else's territory. Right? So the United States is the latter. The British were never able to colonize the Native Americans, and there wasn't the same sort of imperative to colonize because of the amount of land there was, especially in the first century of American colonization. But most colonies are the former kind, right, where colonization means colonization not just of land but of people. And so, in India, the entirety of India was run by the British Raj, who was a colonist, right? And the British colonial India was essentially an enormous offshoot of the East India Company. And what does the colonial government do? The colonial government, yes, it writes the laws and enforces the laws and is the form of government in those countries, but it's there essentially to protect and maintain the trade routes and trade relations and the production of the commodities for trade to Europe. It's there as infrastructure to support the economic interests that were there originally. So colonization is always an economic enterprise. Now, with that established, right, the economic basis for colonization, what interests Fanon in Black Skin, White Masks is less the economic facets of colonialism, and more the psychological and cultural effects of colonization. In other books, for example, The Wretched of the Earth, another book by Fanon, he goes into more detail about the economic side of things. Fanon was a Marxist and believed in, you know, well, I won't get into too much detail about that, but in essence, believed that, right, believed in this whole story about the economic interest behind colonization, and believed that the only way for colonized people to take control of their land and themselves was by taking control of the means of production. Anyway, not that important, but, well, actually very important, but not the main point of this chapter, the first chapter of Black Skin, White Masks. Instead, Fanon is interested in the psychological effects of colonization. And in that sense, what he is giving us in Black Skin, White Masks is an analysis of racism and how racism comes from colonization, how colonization creates and maintains racism. So, without, again, going into too much detail, colonization begins with these economic interests. But in order to justify the colonization, one has to suppose a kind of racial superiority to the people that are being colonized. Let's back up a minute and think about what colonization really looks like, what colonialism really was. What is it that, what are we told colonialism was about? Colonialism was about, when it comes to colonizing South America, Africa, Southeast Asia, we're told that colonization was about civilizing the world, right? That in itself already implies a kind of racism, right? Namely that the Europeans, the colonizers, are civilized, and that the Amerindians, the Africans, the Vietnamese and Lao and Cambodians are not. So this very, even the sort of best version of colonization, that it was about civilizing the peoples of the world, is a paternalistic and condescending idea that assumes that European culture is the only civilized culture, and that civilization is synonymous with Europeanness, with whiteness, in essence. Okay? And so the civilizing colonizer comes in to paternalistically teach the colonized how to be people, in essence. And this all connects back to concept of race, which is developed in the 18th century, and from its inception, the concept of race, pseudoscientific concept, kind of interpretation of history, posited that the white race was inherently superior to all other races. Right? This comes from, in particular, a German philosopher named Immanuel Kant. Kant, very important philosopher, but also very racist one. So I'm going to send you guys a video where I talk about this in some more detail. But this concept of race is a pseudoscientific, a false category, essentially. And it always included in its articulation a concept of a hierarchy of races. So the very concept of race has baked into it racism. The very concept of race has baked into it is inherently racist, from its inception. Now, with this idea of race and the racial superiority of the colonizer, that makes it, from a European perspective, justifiable to colonize. It makes it, not just justifiable, but noble to bring civilization. But when we think about what colonialism actually was, not what it was said to be, but what it actually was, we see the racism of it in a much more stark way. And as I said, colonization was not about civilizing. It was about subjugating and exploiting. And that subjugation and exploitation happened in the most brutal ways imaginable. In Martinique, where Fanon is from, punishment for running away, right? A forced laborer, a native who was enslaved by a colonizer and forced to work on a sugar plantation, say. A slave that ran away would have their ear cut off. They did it again, their other ear, then their nose, then their hands, then their legs. I'm sorry, their legs and then their hands. You gotta keep the hands so they can work. The most unimaginably vicious kind of violence was perpetrated against the natives in these colonized countries, right? In Martinique, it was brutal violence, corporeal violence against the laborers, right? The people were enslaved, they were forced to work, and they were, murdered with indifference and mutilated as punishment when they didn't work well enough, refused to work, or escaped. What were they working for? Right? The enrichment of the colonizer. So the price of becoming civilized, what does that mean? That means getting access to electricity. That means participation in the global economy. That means learning a Romance language like French or Germanic language like English. It means learning about European culture, right? European history and art, politics, history. It means having access to European technology. That is what civilization means. But what is the effect of all of that? Let's start with we'll talk about that the rest of the semester. But this civilizing force, right, which is in itself sort of not obviously inherently good. In fact, the point of black skin, white masks is all of that which was said to be to the benefit of the colonized, right? The technology, the access to scientific knowledge, and the history of Europe. All of that is also a form of oppression. But let's just say that there was a benefit to being colonized in the form of access to global markets or new technologies. That comes at an, again, unimaginable physical cost, right? In lives lost, right? The people murdered, the loss of freedom through enslavement, forced labor, and just general sort of annihilation of the spirit and culture of a people. This brutal violence, that is really the heart of colonization. And nowhere is this. I mean, in Martinique, it was atrocious, but it was even worse in Africa. Right. A really good book about this, or a very good book, is King Leopold's Ghost, which talks about history of the Belgian Congo. And King Leopold, who was the Belgian king who colonized the Congo, and just how incredibly horrific the treatment of the Congolese was. I mean, murdering Congolese, truly as though they weren't human. I mean, the extent to which the colonized were treated as subhuman is most obvious in reading about Belgian Congo, where people there were treated worse than animals, really. So extreme violence and exploitation. That is the story of colonialism, the subjugation of the third world. Now, given this situation, the colonial situation, right? What is going to be the outcome? Or how does one recover from colonization? And that's really the question that Fanon is asking. And it's the same, it's a very similar question to how do we get out of racism? How do we get out of, how do we solve racism, if such a thing can be done? And this is what Fanon is talking about here. So let's see. On page 38, I'm working with this edition. Maybe, hopefully, it's the one that you have. On page 38, he writes, "My theme is the disalienation of the Black man." The disalienation of the Black man, right? And we can extend that to mean the disalienation of Black people in general, as individuals and as a community. Disalienation, right? What would it mean to get away from colonial history? What would it mean to solve racism? It would involve disalienation. And I start with that idea because when we're thinking about, along with Fanon, what racism is and how colonization leads to racism and affects the psyches of the colonized, we should think about it in terms of alienation. So what is the post-colonial situation? What is the state also of racism after colonization? So what is the fear of decolonization? The fear, as Fanon says, is on the part of the European that there will be some kind of retaliation for colonialism. Uh, Fear that the former colonies will retaliate, will attempt to replace the former colonizer. Uh, I think that, again, I think with Fanon, you always have to be going back and forth between the individual level and the global level of one person and everyone. And I think that this, right, the history of colonialism is a history of violence and exploitation of, violence against and exploitation uh, of the colonized, of people in the natives in South America, Africa, Asia, across the world, by Europeans, by white people. Right? The history of colonization is the history of white people oppressing non-white people for their own enrichment. And so we have to think about the way that white Western nations, those in Europe, United States, continue to subjugate third world countries economically and militarily and politically. But then we also have to think about the way this colonial history affects interpersonal relations between individuals in the form of racism and our consciousness of racism. Why are white people afraid of Black people? Not to say, obviously, all white people, all Black people, not to say white people are afraid or Black people are scared. And I'm going to try to be as conscious as I can about my own positionality. Why are white people afraid of Black people? First, obviously, the stereotypes that are perpetuated about Black people by the media, by entertainment, by the news, by culture in general. Why is it, in whose benefit is it to portray non-whites as a threat to whites? In whose benefit is it to portray Black people as scary, as intimidating? Who wants to perpetuate this fear and antagonism? That's one question. But I think I can also say there is a kind of unconscious acknowledgement that that white people are due for some retaliation. And I think that, concept that's been going around a lot recently is this idea of white fragility, white anxiety, um, all the fear people have about demographics, right? The nation becoming less white, uh, and the intense uh, pathologies on the part of white people around Black Lives Matter movement. Uh, there is a definite unwillingness to acknowledge this history, but at the same time, I think a tacit, unconscious awareness of it. The reason to not talk about it is the awareness that one is complicit in it, responsible for it. Anyway, man, it's a real tangenty day. So, my point was that after colonization, when colonization begins to end, in particular, Fanon is thinking about the 50s and 60s, when India gets independence, but then, most important for him is when the Antilles and the Caribbean and much of Africa gets its independence, actually, right after his death in the 1960s. After the end of colonization, right, what will be the relationship between Europe and former colonies? Once the oppression of Black people, of the colonized, is no longer explicit, once there is no longer a policy of exploitation and oppression, enslavement, how do you come out of that? Right? As white people, we used to enslave Black people. And for Black people who used to be enslaved by white people, how do they look at each other once slavery is over? What do we do with that? And I think that there's an impulse to sort of say, once the policy ends, the whole affair is over. Once slavery is illegal, we can start again. Or once the Voting Rights Act passes, we can start again. Fresh slate, right? We're all set? Are we good? Right? And of course, the answer, well, of course, no, right? Of course not. First of all, because the formerly enslaved knows that their former oppressors are still out there and they're still doing oppression in various forms. And that's the real key. The white people, the oppressors, don't stop oppressing once there's no longer an explicit policy of oppression. I mean, I think this is a specific psychological failure of America that as soon as something is announced, that's often the end of it, right? Uh, I'm not a racist. All right, everything looks good here, um, right? And simply saying I'm not a racist uh, is nothing. Is nothing at all. Uh, and if anything, it's saying I'm not a racist is just a way then to uh, deflect from any criticism. All right. So, what do we do about racism? What is racism? What are the effects of racism? And, so let me just make one more comment before we jump into the text a little bit more. Why are we talking about this in philosophy of the human person? Right? Two reasons. First, everything that Fanon says about being human is extremely important and is kind of culmination of one theme I've been trying to develop this semester, which is the idea that the category human is not a universal category, but is almost always used with an exclusive meaning. And that in one sense, the idea of being human is a way of dehumanizing others, a certain group. And that second thing, that dehumanization has to be an essential part of what we study and think about when we think about what it means to be human. Right? You could teach what it means to be human just through studies of various forms of dehumanization. And so, in thinking about racism as a form of dehumanization, we learn a little bit more about being human, and we see the way the concept of human itself can be used to dehumanize. So on page 17, front page, chapter 1, the Negro and language. And so Fanon's writing in 1950s. Forget actually the year this was first published, 52. And he's using outdated language, right? You're gonna, hear the word Negro. He also uses the N-word relatively freely. So, I think we just have to remember this is, a black man using the language of his time. But anyway, the Negro and language, right? And this is one of the many awkward elements of being a white teacher teaching this stuff. I think it's very important to teach this stuff. It doesn't matter who you are. I think everyone should read this and think about it. But it is feels certainly strange saying Negro. Right? So let's just read this first section. I ascribe a basic importance to the phenomenon of language. Right? That is why I find it necessary to begin with this subject, which should provide us with one of the elements in the colored man's comprehension of the dimension of the other. All right, so again, right, colored man, horribly outdated language. But what's key here, right? It should provide us one of the elements in the colored man's comprehension of the dimension of the other. What does it mean to be other? Right? So this is an important term here, the other. And it's an important term for philosophy, outside of sort of critical race theory. What does he mean by the other here? What is otherness? It is an otherness to the established idea of being human, where there is a sort of homogeneity or a sameness that is said to be common to all people. For example, all Europeans are X, Y, and Z. And then the other is the one who does not fit the expected picture. So the other would be the one who sort of challenges your worldview. The other is the one who comes from a different world and who makes your world relative to you, not universal. And this is why the other is always a threat and a danger. The other exposes the smallness and relativity of your world. The other comes from another world. So here, the other world is the world of the colonized, right? The European world and its other, the colonized world. But we can also think about this simply in interpersonal terms, right? Myself, my ego, and its other, right? Whether that is the external world or another person. So how do I relate to the other? So what is the relation between Europe and its others, and how do I, as an ego, relate to an other? Both questions are about one's ability to be comfortable with the non-absoluteness of your world or of yourself as an ego, to allow the other person to exist as other. And we can go back to, oh, no, different class, sorry. So this is an important idea, right? Think about otherness. There are all different kinds of otherness, but obviously Fanon is focusing on racial otherness, right? The Black man as other, Black people as other to Europeans. So language is going to tell us about this relationship to the other. For it is implicit that to speak is to exist absolutely for the other, right? So language reveals the other in multiple ways, and that's going to be one of the things he focuses on here. Language reveals the other, and in the first place, simply because you only speak ever to be heard by somebody else. Language implies a relationship with some other. So it makes sense, right, if we are thinking about relationships to others to begin with language. So he goes on. The Black man has two dimensions, one with his fellows, the other with the white man. The Negro behaves differently with a white man and with another Negro. That this self-division is a direct result of colonist subjugation is beyond question. Okay, right? This is the first insight, that it is because of colonization that, let's take this one piece at a time. Right? New thought, language, and the other. New thought. The Black man has two dimensions. One is reserved for his relation with other Black people, right? Other colonized, and the other is reserved for his relations with the colonizer, with white people. Right? One speaks differently in the presence of white people than one does when no white people are around. This leads to an inner division, right? A self-division within Black subjectivity. And this is the psychological content that Fanon wants to analyze here, right? What is the psychological experience of racism for the colonized person, for the subjugated person? It is this self-division, right? The fact that one has sort of one language to speak to the colonizer and a different language to speak to other members of the colonized group. So I do have notes here. I just don't follow them. So this first chapter is kind of a strange chapter in that what he's really doing is walking through various racist tropes. He is presenting the colonized, the Black person, in the way that the colonizer sees them, right? And sort of laying out this fundamental opposition between colonizer and colonized. So let's see. The first, or what does this mean, or what does this self-division imply? What is divided? How does the self-division manifest itself? It says on page 18, the problem that we confront in this chapter is this. Right? I'll go on. The Negro of the Antilles, right, of the French Caribbean, will be proportionately whiter. That is, he will come closer to being a real human being in direct ratio to his mastery of the French language. So, first, what do we see? We see that language connotes being a human being and being white. So let's just think about this big picture a little bit, right? You are a colonized person in Martinique. Your language is Creole. Creole is what you speak with your family, with your friends, what have you. But the official language, the language you have to speak at work, in court, in any official capacity, is French. right? Thus, the better one is able to speak French, the better one is able to participate in the affairs of economy and state that are happening, right? And thus, the more human one is. So, the French colonizer views the colonized, because of their race, as subhuman. And by virtue of that fact, manages to exploit the colonized and get a lot of money. The French person views the colonized as subhuman, views themselves as human. What are the markers that mark the colonized as being subhuman from the perspective of the French colonizer? There will be several. Right? The absence of technology, the absence of scientific reasoning, which are Western values, the absence of other Western values, the absence of Christianity, the absence of essentially European culture. Technology, scientific knowledge, above all, are used as indications of the inherent and essential superiority of the white race, of white people, of their superior humanity. Now, there are lots of good explanations. I encourage you to read more about sort of these ideas about race, right? But we'd say there are, the racist idea is Europeans develop technology and science because they are essentially, their race is essentially superior. And the rest of the world didn't because they are essentially inferior. Now, that's obviously garbage in many ways. It is essentializing history, saying history is can only be the one way, is essential, right? What happened in history could only have happened this way, and it happened according to God's plan and according to this sort of inner worth and value of the people, rather than what we would say today, that science and technology develop in certain places among certain people because of material factors. The denser the population, and Europe had a much denser population than a lot of places in the world, most anywhere else in the world. Density of population leads to greater communication and socialization leads to greater development and innovation and technology, scientific advancement through discussion, that sort of thing, right? Population density. But also then what resources are available to you, right? Do you have access to steel? Do you have access to, the kind of, whatever the materials are that are needed in order to develop these things? So there are material particularities that explain the unequal sort of technological and scientific advancement among peoples. That has nothing to do with the essential value of a people, certainly not based on something as superficial and meaningless as skin color, right? Which is not to say that there aren't important cultural differences between people, but that those cultural differences have nothing to do with the superficial physical differences that are the markers of race. So if you have told yourself this story, right? Europeans are superior and more human, then the absence of Europeanness is tantamount to the absence of humanness. And so, you have to be human in order to participate in affairs of state, official capacities. And in colonies, that means speaking French. When a colonized person then is able to master French, they become more human, right? Insofar as speaking French is a marker of being human, whereas speaking Creole is a marker of being subhuman from the European perspective. So, right, in direct ratio, come closer to being a real human being in direct ratio to his mastery of the French language. He goes on a little, lower on 18. Every colonized people, in other words, every people in whose soul an inferiority complex has been created by the death and burial of its local cultural originality, finds itself face to face with the language of the civilizing nation, that is, with the culture of the mother country. So, every colonized people, and here Fanon gives a kind of definition of what it means to be colonized, right? Anyone who has developed an inferiority complex based on the death and burial of their local cultural originality, right? What happens in colonization is the destruction of an entire culture, the annihilation of culture. In many cases, it was illegal to speak native languages. One had to speak French, not only in official capacities, but everywhere. All native religion practices, forms of government are abolished. All the local means of production are replaced with European means of production, European culture, society, and the mechanisms of society. So this erasure, not just erasure, but annihilation of a culture leads to an inferiority complex, right? If you think about the relation between the Greeks and the Persians in the ancient world, there may have been tribalism and hostility and antagonism between those people, but it's going to be a different thing than modern racism because it doesn't involve the annihilation and, importantly, replacement of a culture. It is two cultures fighting each other, but each culture remains intact, right? In colonization, one culture annihilates, eradicates the other culture, and leaves the people that formerly had a culture without one, and tells them, you must, right, assimilate to our culture, to European culture, French culture. And so, to be forced to participate in a culture that is not natively yours is going to create an inferiority complex, right? The idea that you don't belong, that you're not truly sort of a part of any culture. Right? So it goes on, right? The colonized is elevated above his jungle status in proportion to his adoption of the mother country's cultural standards. He becomes whiter as he renounces his blackness, his jungle. So, everything in colonization encourages and even forces the colonized to abandon their culture, to adopt French culture in order to become human, right? Uh, there is then among the colonized this great desire to become like the colonizer, right? Because the local native culture has been annihilated, the colonized can either adopt the culture of the colonizer or reject it and attempt to find something entirely new. And this is one of the main things that Fanon is interested in other writings, right? This difficulty of finding a new form of governance and culture and being for these post-colonial peoples. But in many cases, right, the colonized desires to become French, desires to become white, desires to become something that, uh, to become their oppressors. And this leads to right, this sort of fetishization of French culture on the part of the colonized. And this leads also then to sort of interesting discussion about the pecking order among colonized peoples and sort of whole hierarchy that's established by the racism of colonization, which is, this is what he's talking about. The Antilles, the people of the Antilles, are the most admired of the colonized peoples, and that is attached probably to negritude and this is there in this rich culture post-colonial world. And he's talking about the Senegalese view themselves as below that. And they want to learn to speak Creole, so they'll be mistaken for native of the Antilles. Although he does have something interesting to say about language here also, right? That to find a culture that's not the colonizer's culture would require, or he doesn't say require, he thinks it would be interesting to abandon the language of the colonizer and right, develop a culture based on the native culture. And indeed, that is, in many cases, an important part of the process. So he's talking about how there are no sort of original cultural works in Creole on page 27, 28. Says there are, in contrast, real works of art translated from the Pool and Wolof dialects of Senegal. And I found great interest in following the linguistic studies of Sheikh Ata Diop. So in Senegal, right, I think one of the sources of Senegal is one of the most successful post-colonial governments in Africa, and Senegalese democracy has been, uninterrupted since its liberation in the '60s. And I think one of the reasons why Senegal has had success, where many other, formerly colonized African nations have had less success politically, right? Succumbing to strong men and dictatorships. Fanon has a lot of analysis of why those dictatorships take root and sort of what their essence is. But one of the reasons why Senegal is successful is that it did uh, produce a lot of culture uh, in its own language. In particular, it had a thriving film industry that was integral in providing what Fanon would call a national consciousness and kind of sense of themselves through art. Right? So, um, in order to develop oneself as a formerly colonized individual or culture, and not just to adopt the culture of the colonizer, of the oppressor, means sort of creating with your own resources, your own means, your own language, your own ideas and values, and art and cultural productions that are uniquely your own. And Senegal did a good job in that, just as Martinique did, right, with Aimé Césaire. So the production of culture is really important, and I think that in particular is interesting in that we're told what is the essence of the humanism of Europe. Well, it lies in its culture, right? And to not have European culture means to not have humanism. Well, the antidote to that is to create a culture that is not European, that is unique and original. But that's no easy task, right? So he goes on. What is there to say? Purely and simply this. And now he's talking about philosophy, right? How do we, again, escape this racism? When a bachelor of philosophy from the Antilles refuses to apply for certification as a teacher on the ground of his color, I say that philosophy has never saved anyone. When someone else strives and strains to prove to me that black men are as intelligent as white men, I say that intelligence has never saved anyone. And that it is true and that is true, for if philosophy and intelligence are invoked to proclaim the equality of men, they have also been employed to justify the extermination of men. That's page 28, 29. So, there's no point from Fanon's perspective to demonstrating the equality between people, between races, because that equality is not what is at issue. One doesn't become racist, and racism is not invented and perpetuated and stoked because one truly believes that the races are inherently unequal. So the attempt to solve racism, I mean, it's a preposterous phrase, right? Solving racism, like it's a math problem, but the attempt to address racism by pointing out the objective equality between races is futile, because that's not the point. The point of racism is to oppress, and to oppress in order to yourself be superior. So the only way to address racism is with this direct confrontation, a direct confrontation of cultures, and not to demonstrate that one is capable of speaking perfect French, of knowing European history, or understanding the sciences perfectly. All that can show that there is no inequality between the races, but demonstrating that does not lead to the end of racism, because racism is the assertion of inequality, the creation of inequality, and not a response to a good faith belief in inequality. Right? One doesn't oppress because one believes someone should be oppressed. One oppresses for one's own benefit and then justifies that oppression by saying, right, this is how it should be. So this gets into the larger question of the paternalism of white culture, of the Europeans. Right, so on 31, he writes, a white man addressing a Negro behaves exactly like an adult with a child and starts smirking, whispering, patronizing, cousining. It is not one white man I have watched, but hundreds, and I have not limited my investigation to any one class, but if I may claim an essentially objective position, I have made a point of observing such behavior in physicians, policemen, employers. I shall be told by those who overlook my purpose that I should have directed my attention elsewhere, that there are white men who do not fit my description. To these objections, I reply that the subject of our study is the dupes and those who dupe them, the alienated. Right? So, I highlight this passage because, again, it is not that this the oppression of racism is achieved only by the ruling class. That is to say, by the rich. It is for the rich and in the interest of the rich that colonization happened at all. However, it is not only the rich who are racist. I mean, obviously. But this is an important point, right? That although racism is essentially derived from colonial economic exploitation, it has surpassed and exceeds the aims and sphere of colonization. So that the ones who are racist are not just the ones who are doing the oppressing, the colonizing, but are all of the people who are told they're superior in the name of that colonization. And so this colonization sweeps up everyone, white people of all classes, whether or not they themselves are reaping any benefits from the oppression of those people. And so, if you think about, there's another really good book that I recommend everyone read. It's called The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander. It came out 2010, 15, somewhere around then, before 2015. And she tells us an interesting story about the early days of the United States, when there was still a sense of fellow feeling between the slaves that worked on plantations and the indentured servants who were white, who worked on plantations. The black enslaved people and the indentured white servants saw that they had a common enemy, a common exploiter and oppressor, who was the rich plantation owner. And that was a danger. Right? It was dangerous that poor whites and the oppressed black population should find solidarity with each other. Because if they're united, and they're united against the plantation owner, then the plantation owner is in a lot of trouble, right? So, rather than change the economic system, rather than prevent either one of them from being his enemies, the plantation owners use racism to sow division between the indentured servants and the slaves by saying, right, you white indentured servants, you shouldn't feel solidarity and sympathy with the slaves. You're not exploited and oppressed in the same way. Right? You are superior to them because you're white. Right? And so, right, what could have been class solidarity between all those who are exploited by the rich is broken apart through racism. And now the poor white sees themselves as, identifies with the rich white person rather than the poor black person. So this racial solidarity is an enormous benefit, again, to the rich. Yeah. So this is why there's racism in every class, right? Why racism is not just a question of class, and that, right, racism exceeds economics. It can't be solved through economics alone. Now, the other point that Fanon makes several times about language is the way that the white person uses language when speaking to the black person, right? Where they adopt a kind of Creole or kind of Pidgin English, right? And the attempt, Fanon says, or right, says, acknowledges, right? And the white person says, I was just, trying to be understandable. So, he gives this example, right? Someone says something like, you go outdoor, see, go corridor, you go straight, go one car, go two car, go three car, you there. And that's the kind of example of Pidgin English. When you speak, you still see people doing this to immigrants, right? Often, right, where you sort of speak a broken English with the belief that it's more understandable or accommodating to them. Fanon thinks, no, right, that says something else. Right? That says, yes, right, don't learn the language. You're fine speaking this broken language, this Pidgin English. Stay in your place. That's good enough, right? I won't teach you, or I won't speak to you in proper English. I shouldn't say teach. I won't speak to you in proper English because that would, right, connote more dignity than I believe you're worth. So he says, I think this is an important point. So he's talking about this teacher who is teaching immigrants and other people how to speak English. And he's talking about, so let me see what I want to read here. Forgive me. Okay. To speak pidgin to a Negro makes him angry because he himself is a pidgin N-word talker. The N-word. I mean, the phrase the N-word. It's very interesting the way that works, right? The way the phrase the N-word works. Anyway, I will be told there is no wish, no intention to anger him, speaking pidgin. I grant this, but it is just this absence of wish, this lack of interest, this indifference, this automatic manner of classifying him, imprisoning him, primitivizing him, decivilizing him, that makes him angry. Right? So the indifference, the lack of curiosity, the sort of assumption that one understands, right, to classify and imprison him. This indifference is a kind of imprisonment to say, oh, I know how to talk to you, right? And this is sort of just about stereotypes, really. But how stereotypes work through action, right? Which is, if I say, if I see a group of, if I'm let's say I'm a colonist, and I see a group of colonized people, a group of Black people, and I say, oh, don't worry, I know how to talk to them, right? And I go and speak some pidgin English. What is happening is I'm enacting, right, that stereotype. I am actively classifying them that way, categorizing people. Anyway, and so this, he says, also is achieved through the media and entertainment, right? He says on page 34, the Negro has to be shown in a certain way. He has no culture, no civilization, no long historical past. Right? So Black people have to be shown with the same stereotype, he says on 35. And, we see this all the time in our culture, right? The way Black Americans are portrayed in the news media, in entertainment, in Hollywood, and TV, there are a few stereotypes that are repeated over and over again, right? And what is the effect of those stereotypes, right? That you learn that these are the ways that people see you, that you're expected to be, and if you internalize them, right, you feel compelled to emulate these stereotypes, that inferiority complex. Now, and so this is why the issue of representation is important. The way Black people are represented in Hollywood, on TV, and also then, most importantly, right, diversifying at the highest levels who is in charge of Hollywood and TV to allow Black people, but also all other types of identities, minority identities, to represent themselves. Right? Entertainment should present self-representations rather than representations of the other. Right? Representations of the other are powerful, negatively powerful. And so if you only, see, anyway. So he says, what is important is not to educate them, but to teach the Negro not to be the slave of their archetypes. Right? We don't need to. It's less important to educate those who perpetuate stereotypes as it is to teach those who are stereotyped to ignore those stereotypes, to not be controlled by this culture, right? To recognize it as oppression. So he says, when the first impulse of the Black man is to say no to those who attempt to build a definition of him. And it is understandable that the first action of the Black man is a reaction. And since the Negro is appraised in terms of the extent of his assimilation, it is also understandable why the newcomer expresses himself only in French. Right? So, sort of one of the other psychological aspects of racism here is the fact that for the oppressed, their identity is always built through this initial rejection of the stereotype. Right? I have to define myself first in distinction from the racist expectations, the racist stereotypes that attempt to define me. So this is sort of the way in which this is a form of oppression, right? To force someone to define themselves in reaction to some forced definition that's foisted upon them. All right. So in general, then, I think what we're looking at is a large-scale system of control in Foucault's sense. Fanon is obviously analyzing it along different lines with different themes and thinking about it differently. But the idea that all these different elements of society, right, from economic growth to Hollywood depictions to interpersonal relationships on the street between different races, is all sort of caught in one story about colonialism, about power, and that the story is about what it means to be human and how one can be human. It is, right, I mean, again, I think one of the difficult dynamics here is the way that the construction of an idea of being human dehumanizes those that are excluded from that idea. But more generally, to think about the ways that power global power impacts even our individual identities. And to think about also just to think about the small ways that everyday life perpetuates racial caste systems. All right. That's all for today.